In the pale light after Dunkirk, the beaches of northern France were quiet again, scattered with boots, rifles, and the evidence of an escape no one in Berlin wanted to fully acknowledge. Across a narrow stretch of grey water, Britain was wounded, shaken, and still standing. And standing, it turned out, was everything. This is episode 14 of our long-form journey through the Second World War. Tonight we move from the stolen hours after evacuation into the long, watchful summer of 1940, when delay became destiny and the fate of Europe narrowed to the skies over one island. If you enjoy this kind of storytelling, please like and subscribe. It genuinely helps keep these episodes coming. And if you feel like it, leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Take a slow breath, and let's begin. In the grey hour before dawn on the 5th of June, 1940, two senior officers of Germany's Luftwaffe walked slowly along the broad shoreline near the northern French port of Dunkirk. The tide had pulled back, and the wet sand still held the impressions of everything that had stood or moved across it in recent days. Boot marks, tire treads, the long, shallow furrows left by men who had dragged themselves toward the water's edge. The wind came in steadily off the channel, carrying salt and smoke, and the particular cold that settles on a coastline after a night of uncertainty. The beach was not empty. It would not be truly empty for a long time. In every direction, spread across the pale sand as far as either man could see, lay the accumulated wreckage of a retreating army. Thousands of shoes had been stripped from the feet of soldiers who had waded out into the cold water to reach the rescue boats waiting offshore. Bicycles stood in long and listing rows, abandoned precisely where their riders had stepped off and walked into the sea. Military trucks sat at odd angles in the sand, as though they had simply been parked and forgotten. Rifles lay half buried by the tide. Towering stacks of tinned food stood carefully arranged and then left behind entirely, and threading through all of it, lifted and set down again by the morning wind, a perpetual soft storm of papers, orders, lists, communications that had once seemed urgent, now drifting across the shore. One of the two officers, General Hoffmann von Waldau of the Luftwaffe General Staff, paused beside a mound of empty wine and whiskey bottles gathered near the remains of some officer's mess. He nudged one of the bottles with the toe of his boot, listening to its dull sound against the sand. Then he raised his arm and swept it slowly across the whole vast scene. Here, he said, was the grave of British hopes in this war. He gestured down at the empty bottles at his feet. And these, he added, with quiet contempt, were the headstones. The man beside him did not respond with any equivalent satisfaction. He was shorter and broader than von Waldau, with a thick-set frame and a wide face, in which small dark eyes moved with the calm steadiness of someone long accustomed to making difficult assessments. This was Erhard Milch. He held the rank of general, and served the Luftwaffe both as its Inspector General and as deputy to its chief, Field Marshal Hermann Göring. His uniform carried the campaign ribbons of the previous war, a war that had ended, in his experience, with certainties dissolving into something no one had prepared for. Milch stood still and looked out through the morning mist. The hulks of British vessels were just visible in the shallows, dark shapes against the pale water. Beyond them, the channel moved in long grey swells toward a horizon that concealed England on its far side. He looked at the wreckage and the shoes and the silent guns, and his expression carried nothing of his companion's pleasure. He did not see a defeated enemy in these remains. He saw the evidence of an escape, and he understood with a kind of clarity that comes from experience rather than enthusiasm precisely what that meant. "They are not buried yet," he said quietly. Then, after a long moment, in a voice addressed less to von Waldau than to the grey water and the mist beyond it, "We have no time to waste." It was not a statement born of fear. It was something more measured and more troubling, a cold-eyed reading of the evidence that the beach itself provided, stripping away the intoxicating noise of recent victory. The shoes told one story. The sheer scale of them told another entirely. Soldiers had gone into that water in their thousands, tens of thousands. They had left their weapons and their vehicles and their supplies, but they had kept the one thing that could not be replaced, their lives and the possibility of returning. Somewhere across that flat grey water, an army was pulling itself back together. Beaten and humiliated and empty-handed, yes, but alive, and armies that survived had a way, given time and purpose, of becoming formidable again. For Milch, standing in the cold of that early morning, the central fact of Dunkirk was not the brilliance of the German advance. It was the incompleteness of the result. Every hour that followed was an hour offered freely to the enemy. Every dawn that came without German boots crossing the Channel was a morning in which England grew incrementally harder to reach, incrementally stronger, incrementally more resolved. He turned from the water eventually and began to walk again, but the thought did not leave him. It would not leave him for many weeks to come. Later that same day, General Milch made his way to the armoured railway train that served as Field Marshal Goering's mobile command centre, positioned some miles inland from the coast. The interior was warm, well lit, and entirely removed in atmosphere from the cold and the desolation of the shore. Around the conference table sat the men who commanded the most powerful air force the world had ever assembled. General Albert Kesselring of Air Fleet 2, General Hugo Spurler of Air Fleet 3, General Hans-Jürgen Stumpf of Air Fleet 5, and the Chief of Staff, General Hans Jeschonnek. They had gathered in the shared understanding that the hard part was finished. The campaign in the West was effectively over. What remained was the formality of deciding what came next. Goering arrived in a state of obvious physical renewal. He was a large man, and excess had been a persistent companion for some years, but recent weeks had made him appear almost vigorous. A nurse travelling with the train had persuaded him to reduce his daily intake of paracodeine, the mild pharmaceutical to which he had quietly become dependent, to 30 tablets. His personal masseur had worked on him consistently enough to diminish some of his considerable bulk. His valet had dressed him that morning in a new silk uniform that caught the light as he moved, and the total impression he created as he entered the carriage was of a man enlarged somehow by the weight of his own success. He worked his way around the table with energy. He embraced his generals. He laughed. He slapped shoulders and gripped forearms, radiating the pleasure of someone who believes he has finally seen the shape of a great achievement. Then he settled at the head of the table and addressed them. He opened with France. Feelers from French government sources, he explained, were already arriving quietly through intermediaries. Early signals that the armistice most people now expected would not be long in coming. The continent, he implied, was nearly settled. Then he turned his attention to the British. What had happened at Dunkirk, he told his assembled commanders, amounted to the destruction of the British army. The expeditionary force had been shattered under the relentless pressure of German arms, broken beyond any meaningful capacity to recover. It was here that Milch spoke. He did so without drama, which perhaps made it more effective. He had been at the beaches that very morning, he said. He had walked the full breadth of the shoreline himself. From what he had witnessed with his own eyes, the British army was far from annihilated. He had counted at most 20 or 30 dead soldiers across the entire sweep of that shore. The overwhelming majority of the men who had opposed Germany in France and Belgium had crossed the Channel and were now on English soil. He was correct in every detail. German bombers had sent more than 200 vessels of the rescue fleet to the bottom of the Channel, and still the British had carried off 224,000 of their own troops, 85% of the total expeditionary force, along with 114,000 French soldiers and a small contingent of Belgians. The men who reached England were physically spent and had abandoned every piece of heavy equipment they possessed. Their morale was low and their formations badly disrupted, but they were alive and they were home, and what had crossed that water was still, recognizably, an army. Milch did not dismiss what Germany had achieved. Driving the British from the continent in 3 weeks was genuinely formidable work. It had wounded English pride in ways that would take time to heal. He acknowledged that freely. What he refused to allow to stand unchallenged was the comfortable notion that the evacuation had resolved the problem of Britain. Goering's certainty appeared to shift as the words settled over the table. He asked his Inspector General what the Luftwaffe should do next. The answer came without hesitation. Every available unit should be transferred to the Channel coast without delay. The invasion of Great Britain had to begin immediately, while the evacuated army was still scattered and shaken, still unarmed, still absorbing the shock of the retreat. Give them 3 or 4 weeks to recover, Milch warned, and the opportunity would be lost entirely. Goering's first response was brief and dismissive. The proposal was simply not workable, he said. But the conversation did not end there. The logic of Milch's argument proved difficult to set aside, and over the hours that followed, as discussion continued around the table, the field marshal's position began, almost imperceptibly, to shift. By the time the meeting concluded, the rough outline of a plan had taken shape, a plan that would, in the months ahead, give the summer of 1940 its defining and terrible meaning. The following morning, Goering travelled to the small Belgian village of Brûlé-la-Pêche, just over the border from France, where Hitler had established his temporary forward headquarters. He arrived carrying the plan his staff had assembled through the previous evening, and he presented it with the bearing of a man who has privately decided he is about to change the course of history. "Mein Führer," he said, "here is the blueprint for victory." The plan was well constructed, provided, above all, that it was launched before the British could find their balance again. At its heart lay the concept of an airborne assault on England's southern coast. The opening phase would be a concentrated and overwhelming attack by bombers and dive bombers across a broad stretch of the coastline, striking at defences, communication lines, and the infrastructure holding the resistance together. Under the cover of that sustained bombardment, German paratroopers would descend onto English soil and seize an airfield. That airfield would then become the artery through which everything flowed, a continuous relay of Junkers transport aircraft carrying 5 elite divisions transferred from Army Command to the Luftwaffe. Once those soldiers were on the ground, they would spread outward through the English countryside with the speed and momentum that had characterized the campaign across France. Goering had thought carefully about the obstacles. He addressed them directly rather than leaving them to one side. Defeating Britain required more than landing soldiers on its shores. It meant severing the maritime supply lines that kept the island fed. It meant putting the major ports out of action. And it meant confronting the Royal Navy, still the most powerful fleet in the world, which would not stand aside and allow an invasion force to cross unopposed. Here, though, Goering believed he had identified something important. The invasion itself, he argued, would function as a mechanism for drawing both of Britain's principal fighting forces into a single space. The naval vessels scattered across the North Sea and the Mediterranean, the warships sheltering in the heavily defended harbour at Scapa Flow in the far north of Scotland, all would be compelled southward by the logic of the crisis, converging on the narrow channel waters. And at that same moment, the entire RAF would rise to contest the skies above the battlefield. For Goering, this convergence was the decisive opportunity the campaign required. With the fleet and the air force committed together to one concentrated space, the Luftwaffe could destroy them simultaneously, in the air above and on the water below. He conceded without apparent anxiety that the fighting would be desperate and the losses on both sides heavy. But at the climactic moment, 5 additional divisions held in reserve across the Channel would cross and enter the battle. That final reinforcement, he predicted, would settle the question entirely. England would be taken. There was a private dimension to the plan that Goering kept largely to himself, though it lent the whole proposal a particular warmth in his imagination. This was to be a Luftwaffe operation from the first hour to the last. The 10 army divisions involved would serve under his command. The naval vessels and river barges required for supply and follow-up purposes would also fall within his coordination. The glory of bringing Britain down, of delivering the final great prize of the Western campaign, would belong overwhelmingly to the service he had built and led. This carried a personal significance for Goering that extended well beyond strategy. He was careful enough not to say so aloud. Instead, he pressed the one point that he believed would carry everything before it. The operation had to begin within days. Every argument in its favour depended entirely on acting before the British could recover their footing. The army that had come home from the beaches was still scattered and disarmed, still absorbing the shock of what had overtaken it in France. The ports were not yet fully defended. The country had not yet completed whatever psychological transition was necessary to move from shock to resolution. This window, Goering stressed, was real but narrow. It would close. He finished and waited, with the air of someone who has already decided the answer. What he received instead left him speechless. Hitler made clear that he understood the practical elements of the plan and regarded them as reasonable. His objection came from an entirely different direction. He did not believe the invasion was or would be necessary. The British, he told Goering, were a rational people. Given what had happened to them and given the overwhelming force arrayed against them, they would, in time, recognize the hopelessness of their position. A settlement was coming. He had no desire to grind their faces in defeat. "Do nothing," he said. The order left Goering speechless. When General Milch learned of it, it produced in him something closer to a controlled fury. For those who had stood on the beaches and counted the shoes and understood the true scale of the escape, Hitler's confidence in a forthcoming British capitulation was not a miscalculation. It was a strategic disaster in the making, and every day it persisted was a day that could not be recovered. Hitler's reasoning rested on assumptions that had not yet been tested against reality. He believed the British government, confronted with the calamity that had befallen them, would eventually reach the only rational conclusion available, that their cause was lost, that further resistance would inflict enormous suffering for no achievable end, and that a negotiated peace was by far the wiser path. He also wished, in his own telling, not to humiliate a people he regarded as civilized. Britain was an empire he genuinely admired. Something in the blend of his ideology and his calculation made him reluctant to bring it low when the cost of leaving it standing seemed, to him, entirely manageable. He wanted, therefore, not an invasion. He wanted a phone call, a letter through a neutral party, a quiet signal that reason had prevailed. Milch recorded his response in the privacy of his diary, where he could afford to say what he actually believed. He thought it was madness, not impatience or recklessness, genuine strategic madness. He had no confidence whatsoever that the British would sue for peace. Everything he understood about their history and their character suggested precisely the opposite. They would close ranks and dig in. They would spend every day Germany gave them making themselves harder to dislodge, harder to reach, harder to break. And each of those days, he wrote, represented a vital 60 minutes offered freely to an enemy who would use every one of them with care. The one voice that could have settled the question, had Hitler been inclined to hear it, was already speaking clearly from across the Channel. Winston Churchill had come to power only weeks earlier, following the resignation of Neville Chamberlain, and he had addressed Parliament even as the last boats from Dunkirk were still turning back toward England. He had spoken in no language of exhaustion or careful option weighing. He had spoken in a voice that left nothing ambiguous. They would fight on the beaches, he told Parliament, on the landing grounds and in the fields, in the streets and on the hills. They would never surrender. The words had carried far enough to reach German ears, and there were those in the Wehrmacht who found them more alarming than reassuring. Hitler, however, appeared to have decided what he believed, and was viewing the world through the frame of that decision. And so the days passed. Germany waited, and Britain used every hour of the waiting. There were those in Britain, thoughtful people, people of experience and conscience, who genuinely believed the moment had come to consider terms. Senior statesmen who looked honestly at the map of Europe and calculated what continuing the war would cost in lives and ruin, measured against whatever realistic prospect of success could actually be imagined. The fall of France had shaken many who had been steadier before it. The question of whether victory was possible and what victory would even mean deserved a serious answer. But Churchill was playing a longer game. While the diplomatic conversations continued through whatever back channels remained open, the country behind him was not standing still. Farmhands and retired officers from the previous war had joined the Home Guard, and they were out on roads and stretches of coastline with hunting rifles, obsolete service weapons, pitchforks and golf clubs, whatever came to hand. They were not yet a serious military force, and they knew it. But they were something. Factories were being retooled and production accelerated. The veterans of Dunkirk were being rearmed as quickly as the supply lines allowed. Fortifications were going up, beaches were being mined, anti-tank obstacles assembled and positioned. Every soldier who had come back from France was a soldier who could, given sufficient time, be placed between the enemy and the English interior. Churchill understood that time was the commodity the situation demanded above all else. Every passing day was a day of concrete, measurable preparation. Every week was a country that looked a little more like a fortress and a little less like a target waiting to be struck. He let the diplomatic conversations breathe and gave them just enough oxygen to sustain themselves, and he used the time they purchased. While Germany waited for Britain to come to terms, the war on the continent completed its final act. France had been holding on in the way that countries sometimes do, long past the point where holding on could change anything of substance. The German advance had been shattering, and the French never recovered their footing after the initial breakthrough through the Ardennes. By the third week of June, the last serious resistance was collapsing, and a new government had been formed under the elderly Marshal Henri-Philippe Pétain, a name that carried enormous weight from the previous war. A hero of Verdun, now reduced to the role of presiding over defeat. The armistice request reached the German side in those same June days. Hitler received it with something far more deliberate than administrative efficiency. He had thought carefully about where the ceremony should take place and what it should be made to mean. The answer he arrived at was precise and unmistakable in its intention. The meeting would be held in the forest of Compiègne, north of Paris, in the same railway carriage where German representatives had accepted the armistice terms of November 1918, the document that had ended the First World War and imposed upon Germany what many in that country had spent 2 decades regarding as an unbearable humiliation. For 22 years that carriage had stood in the forest as a monument to Allied victory and German defeat. Now it would serve again in the same forest, with the roles completely reversed. As the French delegation arrived and took their seats, Hitler occupied the chair where Ferdinand Foch, the supreme Allied commander in 1918, had sat to receive Germany's submission. He did not remain for the full reading of the armistice terms. Having made his statement through the gesture of being present at all, he rose and left before the formal proceedings were concluded. The image was the point, the restored symmetry, the deliberate echo across the decades. The French signed on the 22nd of June. The railway carriage was afterward removed from its position in the forest and transported to Berlin as a trophy of the occasion. The granite monument that had marked the site of the 1918 ceremony was demolished by German engineers, broken apart until nothing recognizable remained. The day after the signing, Hitler turned from war to something more personal. He had never visited Paris, and the city was now open to him. In the early morning hours, with a small group of companions that included architects and artists whose aesthetic judgment he valued, he moved through a city that was quiet and stunned, still absorbing the fact of what had happened to it. He visited the opera, the grand boulevards, the Trocadero. Swastika flags flew from public buildings. The streets were nearly empty. He returned to his headquarters in the late morning, having completed his survey, and later told one of his architects that he had always dreamed of seeing Paris, and that the dream had been more beautiful than he had allowed himself to imagine. With France concluded, the German war machine entered a strange interlude, not quite rest, not quite inaction, but something suspended between the two. German soldiers made their way to the Channel coast and discovered that the war had deposited them in one of the lovelier parts of Europe at one of its better seasons. They bathed in the sea at Deauville and Le Touquet. They sat at cafe tables in towns where only weeks before British officers had ordered drinks in English and left generous tips. The signs above the cafe doors had been changed. Where they once read English spoken here, they now read Man spricht Deutsch. The chairs were the same. The tables were the same. The waiters were the same. Only the uniforms were different. It was a moment of peculiar suspension, the strange quiet after a great storm, when the damage has been done and the full consequences have not yet announced themselves. France was defeated. The British had fled the continent. German power now stretched from the Polish frontier to the Atlantic shore, and across a narrow channel of water, an island that Hitler had expected to negotiate waited, armed with speeches and the remnants of an army that had waded home through the sea. The pause could not last. Everyone present on those summer beaches understood that, even without being told. The question was not whether the next phase was coming, but when, and what it would cost. The order to do nothing against Britain did not mean in the practical reading of Germany's military commanders that nothing at all should be prepared. Hitler had said he wanted no attack on the island kingdom. He had said nothing about making ready for one, and there was a careful and exploitable difference between the two. The senior officers of the German armed services understood this, and they moved accordingly, not to act, but to ensure that action, when it came, would be immediately possible. The Luftwaffe began repositioning first. Air Fleet 2, which had been based in the Low Countries throughout the fighting in France and Belgium, was moved westward to new airfields along the Channel coast. Air Fleet 3, which had operated from bases further inland during the recent campaign, relocated to fields in northern France. Aircraft and crews settled into their new positions with the practiced efficiency of a service that had run 3 major campaigns in less than a year and had learned at minimum how to move. Fighter and dive bomber squadrons assembled on French coastal airfields under the command of General Wolfram von Richthofen, a name that carried its own particular resonance, he being the cousin of the celebrated Red Baron of the previous war. From these new positions, the white cliffs of Dover lay barely 20 minutes away by air. London, on a steady day with a favourable wind, was reachable in an hour. Behind the fighter units, bomber squadrons and Junkers transport aircraft moved forward from their bases deeper inside Germany. Soldiers arrived in French barracks that had recently housed French troops, and the atmosphere of those billets shifted with them. The smell of Caporal cigarettes and rough red wine gave way to the smell of liverwurst and beer, a small domestic transformation that marked in its quiet way how completely the old order had been overturned. At sea, the German Navy was engaged in its own preparations. Barges and small craft of varied kinds were gathered from wherever they could be found. River vessels, canal boats, flat-bottomed craft designed for the slow commerce of inland waterways and moved through the canal networks of Holland and Belgium toward assembly points along the Channel and North Sea coast. They accumulated quietly, vessel by vessel, in harbours and inlets that had never been intended to hold them. The raids the Luftwaffe conducted during these weeks were measured and deliberate. Full-scale attacks were prohibited by Hitler's standing orders, but within those limits the service found ways to keep its pilots sharp and its understanding of the enemy current. Small formations of bombers crossed the channel at night, seeking out airfields and industrial installations in the less heavily defended zones of England, probing the limits of what could be hit and at what cost, building knowledge of navigation routes, searchlight patterns, and the response times of the defenders who rose to meet them. By day, fighter pilots made their way across the Strait of Dover in loose formations to attack the convoys moving goods toward the Thames estuary. These engagements were genuine enough, real targets, real stakes, but they served a secondary purpose. The Germans wanted the RAF to respond, and it generally did. The brief and sometimes violent clashes that followed gave both sides something they had lacked: a direct sense of each other. The German pilots could measure the performance of the Hurricanes and Spitfires that climbed to intercept them, form impressions of individual and collective skill, assess the quality of what was waiting for them on the other side. Reconnaissance aircraft added another layer to the picture. High-altitude German planes swept back and forth across the southern English counties with their cameras running, photographing the coastline, the road networks, the positions of anti-aircraft batteries, the outlines of the airfields. The resulting images gave planners a detailed picture of the physical terrain where any crossing would eventually have to land. What those cameras could not record was the interior of Britain's factories. They could not capture the rate at which new aircraft were leaving the production lines, or the particular quality of the decisions being made in the rooms where the country's future was being shaped. The most consequential developments of those early summer weeks were happening entirely beyond the reach of any lens flying at altitude over the Kentish countryside. Germany was watching carefully, and Britain could feel it. The Luftwaffe's sporadic operations during those early weeks of summer served several purposes at once: testing British defences, providing the pilots with something close to actual combat experience, and delivering a quiet, continuous signal to England that the enemy was present, patient, and had not decided to look elsewhere. At night, small formations of bombers picked their way across the channel toward targets identified in earlier reconnaissance. Airfields and industrial installations in the less defended zones, away from the concentrated radar coverage and fighter stations of the southeast. These raids were calculated rather than destructive in their primary aim. The German crews were building knowledge of the navigation routes that worked best in darkness, of the patterns of searchlights and anti-aircraft fire, of the response times and dispositions of the units that rose to intercept them. Each mission returned with information as much as with bomb damage assessments. By day, the character of the operations shifted. Fighter pilots crossed the strait in loose formations, hunting the convoys that moved steadily through the Narrows toward the Thames estuary and the ports beyond. The attacks were genuine, with real stakes on both sides, but there was a secondary purpose threaded through them. The Germans wanted the RAF to respond, and it consistently did. The engagements that followed were brief and sometimes violent, and both sides emerged from them with something they had not fully possessed before: a direct and personal understanding of the other's capability. What the German pilots found in those early encounters was not entirely comfortable. The RAF pilots who climbed to meet them flew with skill and fought with an aggression that some of the Luftwaffe men found surprising. The aircraft under them, the Spitfire in particular, performed with a quality that a number of German fighter pilots registered privately as genuinely unsettling, though the official reports rendered it in more measured language. The reconnaissance missions ran alongside the combat operations with their own steady rhythm. High-altitude aircraft swept across the southern counties of England, photographing road networks, coastal defences, the layouts of airfields, the fortifications beginning to appear on the beaches. The resulting images gave the German planners a careful and detailed picture of the physical landscape, where the cliffs were unscalable, where the beaches ran flat enough for landing craft, where the ground rose steeply inland, and where it opened into the kind of terrain that armored vehicles could move across. The photographs had limits, however, and the limits were significant. They showed what was visible from the air, and what was visible had begun to diverge substantially from what was actually happening on the ground. The Luftwaffe's intelligence estimates of British aircraft production were badly understated, a miscalculation that would prove enormously costly once the serious fighting began. The analysts examining reconnaissance images were constructing a picture that was accurate in every detail it contained and dangerously misleading in everything it left out. They could not see into the factories working through the nights in the English Midlands. They could not record the production lines or track the rate at which aircraft were rolling out onto operational airfields, and they could not see into British mines where something more durable than any production figure was taking shape. The country was afraid. There was nothing honest in denying that. The shock of France's fall, the images from Dunkirk, the knowledge that an experienced and powerful enemy sat 20 miles across the water, all of it registered, and it registered hard. Fear was present and real. What was also present, and what would ultimately prove more lasting, was a quality of resolution that had settled across the country in the weeks following the evacuation. Something had shifted, somewhere below the level of official statements and broadcast speeches, in a direction that no amount of aerial photography could detect or measure. The Germans watched the coast and photographed the beaches and counted the planes that rose to challenge their pilots over the channel. The knowledge they were building was genuine and would prove useful in time. What it could not tell them was the one thing that would determine whether any of the rest of it mattered. There were people in Britain that summer who looked clearly at the situation and arrived at conclusions that were painful but, to their minds, honest. They were not cowards, these people. They were not traitors, and they were not without courage. They were experienced men of affairs who had spent careers making difficult judgments under pressure, and who surveyed what had happened to the continent over the preceding 9 months and tried to reason their way to an honest answer. France had lasted 6 weeks from the opening of the German offensive to the request for armistice terms. 6 weeks for a country that had spent 20 years fortifying itself against exactly this kind of attack. The numbers were staggering and the speed was unprecedented, and anyone who had watched the campaign unfold without the comfort of ideology or wishful thinking had to reckon with what those facts implied. Against this, Britain possessed a famous navy, an air force of uncertain strength, an army in the process of reconstituting itself after its narrow escape, and a prime minister who seemed constitutionally incapable of acknowledging the word surrender. What it did not possess was any clear and credible path to defeating Germany alone. The cost of trying, the civilian casualties, the material destruction, the sheer grinding weight of sustained aerial assault against a densely populated island was not something that thoughtful people could set aside as an abstraction. The loss of life involved in a prolonged struggle was real and enormous, and it fell, as it always did, on people who had had nothing to do with any of the decisions that had led the world to this point. These were the thoughts that moved quietly through certain drawing rooms and ministerial corridors in London during those early summer weeks. They found expression in careful private conversations, in memoranda circulated among small groups, in the carefully worded arguments of men who believed genuinely that acknowledging a painful truth while there was still time to shape its consequences required a particular kind of courage. The Germans, for their part, were actively encouraging this train of thinking. Nazi diplomats in the neutral capitals of Europe moved through their networks with practiced smoothness, carrying messages, some explicit, some heavily implied, about what peace terms with Hitler might actually mean in practice. Reports circulating through the neutral cities suggested that the Führer held genuine admiration for the British Empire. As Anglo-Saxons, the British measured up in his racial framework to something approaching respectability. He had no wish to dismantle their empire, the rumours went. He sought only acknowledgement of German dominance over the European continent and the return of the colonial territories taken from Germany after the First World War. These signals arrived in London along multiple routes. The Vatican sent its own quiet inquiry through the papal nuncio in Switzerland. The King of Sweden wrote personally, appealing to shared interests and the possibility of avoiding further bloodshed. In Spain, senior German officials held direct conversations with the British ambassador, Sir Samuel Hoare, in meetings that were discreet without being invisible. Churchill's official reply to all of this formed a wall of courteous refusal. When the Swedish king pressed the matter, Churchill's response left no genuine opening. Before any proposal could even be considered, concrete guarantees, not assurances, not words, but demonstrated evidence indeed, would be needed of restored independence for Czechoslovakia, Poland, Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, and France. The list was a form of saying no in the shape of conditions no honest observer could imagine Hitler accepting. Yet the record, examined more carefully in the years after the war, suggested the picture was somewhat more layered than the public posture implied. There were indications that, through certain intermediaries in neutral countries, the British government had allowed the impression to persist that terms might be conceivable, provided the Führer genuinely meant what he was reported to have said about preserving the empire as a functioning element in the global order. Whether this represented genuine ambiguity or a deliberate use of ambiguity as an instrument of policy was a question historians would examine for decades. In Churchill's own mind, the answer was probably simpler than the external record made it appear. The conversations were a way of keeping certain voices occupied, maintaining channels that might serve other purposes, and purchasing the weeks in which the country's actual strength was being assembled. Diplomacy in this reading was one more means of acquiring the one thing that mattered most: time. The truth of Churchill's actual intentions was not particularly difficult to read for anyone watching what he was doing, as distinct from what was being said on his behalf through the neutral capitals of Europe. What he was doing, plainly and without pause, was preparing for a fight. Across the length of England, men who had never imagined themselves soldiers had taken up whatever weapons came to hand and organized themselves into something called the Home Guard. They were not regular troops. Many were too old for active service, others too young, and the weapons available to them ranged from functioning military rifles to hunting pieces to agricultural tools that had never been designed to threaten anyone. Retired officers from the previous war drilled them on village greens and in church halls. Farmhands, school teachers, and former civil servants patrolled 2,000 miles of coastline in the long summer evenings, watching the horizon with the kind of attention that people give to horizons when they have reason to take them seriously. It was not, by any military standard, a formidable force. Everyone involved understood this entirely. The value of the Home Guard lay not in what it could do against a German landing, which was in truth modest, but in what its existence represented. An acknowledgement at the level of the everyday and the ordinary that the country understood what might be coming and had decided to meet it on its feet. Waiting for resistance to begin was no longer something anyone was doing. Resistance had already begun, in every available form, at whatever scale the available materials permitted. The men returning from France were being rearmed as quickly as the situation allowed. The weapons they had left behind on the beaches, the rifles, the artillery, the support vehicles were gone, and replacing them took time that the strategic situation seemed not to have, but the men themselves were back, and they carried with them something that equipment alone could not supply. They had been in a very bad place and had come out alive, and most of them were deeply angry about how it had ended, and that anger had a specific quality, purposeful, contained, pointed in a particular direction. Churchill's clearest statement of his own intentions came on an evening when he summoned members of the Imperial General Staff to a meeting deep beneath Whitehall. The headquarters lay in an underground complex of bare rooms and connecting corridors that the people working there had taken to calling the hole in the ground. A stripped-down world of concrete walls, electric lighting, and the constant background hum of ventilation fans pushing air into spaces that had none of their own. It was functional rather than comfortable, and in that quality it suited the moment. As Churchill entered, the assembled generals and cabinet ministers rose and looked at him in silence. He crossed to the conference table, took the cigar from his mouth and looked slowly around the room, at the plain walls, the folding chairs, the single wooden seat at the head of the table. He waved the cigar around the bare space. This was the room, he said, from which he would direct the war. And if the invasion came, he pointed toward the chair at the head of the table. That was where he would sit. He placed the cigar back in his mouth, drew on it, and then added, he would sit there until the Germans were driven back, or until they carried him out of it dead. The room held its silence. There was not much to say to something like that, and the men present understood it without needing it explained. This was not the language of a government still measuring its options. It was the language of a decision already made and impossible to reverse, a declaration of intent that carried, for those who heard it, the quality of something settled and irrevocable. Outside those underground rooms, the country was at work. Factories ran through the night. Minefields were laid on beaches wide enough to receive landing craft. Anti-aircraft guns were moved into position around the cities and the airfields. The RAF was receiving new aircraft faster than it had 3 months before, though not yet as fast as anyone required. Every day was a ratchet turning in one direction. Every morning that came without a German crossing was another notch forward, quietly taken. By the first days of July, the comfortable assumption that had guided Hitler's thinking since the evacuation was beginning to come apart at its edges. He had expected the British, confronted with the plain facts of their situation, to step back from the edge. He had counted on reason to prevail, on some clear-eyed assessment of what further resistance would cost against what it could realistically deliver. The reports coming back through every available channel told the same story, however. Britain was not negotiating. Britain was building. The factories were operating on a schedule without precedent in peacetime. Workers took their places at the machines and stayed there until their bodies gave way. and then they were helped towards some place where they could rest while their replacements took over before the first had fully cleared the floor. Churchill would describe it later in terms that stayed with those who heard them. Men and women collapsing at their lathes, pulled away and sent home to sleep, while the next shift moved in without interruption. It was not efficiency in any conventional sense. It was something more elemental. A society that had concluded it had no alternative and was responding to that conclusion with everything available. New aircraft were coming off the production lines. New pilots were completing their training. The Hurricane and Spitfire squadrons that would need to contest the skies above southern England were being reinforced, not as quickly as anyone wished, but at a rate measurably greater than the figures appearing in German intelligence summaries. This discrepancy between the actual state of the RAF and what the Luftwaffe's analysts believed it to be was growing with every passing week, and it would carry enormous consequences once the real fighting began. Hitler regarded all of this, to the extent that accurate information was reaching him, with a mixture of genuine bafflement and rising irritation. Churchill, in his estimation, was a drunkard and a bore, a man elevated by accident and obstinacy to a position that required qualities he plainly lacked, surrounded by advisers too foolish or too committed to failed causes to tell him what any rational observer could see. The British people in this reading were being deceived. They were suffering, and the suffering was entirely unnecessary, and the man responsible for it was not the one directing the armies deployed against them. It was a view that said considerably more about Hitler's cast of mind than about Britain's actual situation. In the 10 months since the outbreak of war, Germany's armies had brought the whole of Northern Europe, from the Polish frontier to the Atlantic coast, under German control. Country after country had fallen, and the speed and completeness of the results had astonished even the men directing the campaigns. Yet the people across the Channel continued to behave as though this reality had failed to reach them, or had been received and politely set aside. Their persistence created problems that went beyond wounded pride. The next substantial item on Hitler's agenda was the invasion and destruction of the Soviet Union. The campaign he had always regarded as the true purpose of the war, the operation that would deliver the Eastern territories and resources that his ideology demanded. That project had been tentatively scheduled for 1941. A hostile and undefeated Britain still standing when that campaign opened would create complications of a kind that no amount of optimism could make disappear. It was not merely an annoyance, it was a structural threat to everything that came after. He wrote to Mussolini complaining that the British were treating him shabbily, as though offering them generous peace terms deserved a better response than the one being given. The letter carried the tone of a man genuinely puzzled by the ingratitude of people who had been offered something reasonable and were declining it for reasons he could not quite bring himself to fully credit. But by July, the conclusion he had resisted was becoming unavoidable. The window during which a relatively limited operation might have resolved the matter had closed. A new decision was required, and it could not be deferred indefinitely. He turned back, with the reluctance of a man who would rather have been spared the necessity, to the question of force. On the 16th of July, 1940, a top-secret directive went out from Hitler's headquarters to the senior commanders of Germany's armed forces. It announced, with the measured formality that official directives maintain even when describing enormous things, that the Führer had decided to begin preparations for a landing operation against England. The language was characteristically conditional. England, the directive stated, despite finding herself in a militarily hopeless situation, had shown no willingness to reach a settlement. The purpose of the operation would be to eliminate the British motherland as a base for continuing the war, and if circumstances required it, to occupy the country entirely. The phrase, "if necessary," appeared more than once. These were not the words of a man who had committed himself irrevocably to what he was ordering. They were the words of a man preparing a very large and very violent option, while still hoping, somewhere, that the option would not need to be exercised. The code name assigned to the operation was Sea Lion. The choice attracted some private amusement among those who noticed that the lion happened to be Britain's own national emblem, a fact that made any pretense of operational secrecy somewhat beside the point. The officer responsible for assigning code names was General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Staff of the German Armed Forces, and he had an established reputation within headquarters for selecting names that illuminated the operations they were meant to conceal. In any case, as events would show, secrecy was no longer seriously available. Britain was already preparing for precisely what the directive described. Sea Lion was a plan of considerable ambition, where the earlier Milch-Göring proposal had envisioned a fast and concentrated airborne assault exploiting a window of British vulnerability. Sea Lion was something far more massive in conception. It projected the landing of as many as 250,000 German soldiers on the southern shores of England, across an invasion front roughly 200 miles long, stretching from Ramsgate east of the Chalk Cliffs all the way to Lyme Bay on the western side of the Isle of Wight. The designated landing points included places whose names carried the weight of ordinary English life: Brighton, Folkestone, and at one end of the projected front, the small coastal community of Pevensey, the same shoreline where William the Conqueror's fleet had come ashore in 1066, the last occasion on which England had been successfully invaded from the sea. The vast majority of the soldiers in the first wave would cross the channel in converted river barges, tugs, motorboats, and larger transport vessels. Arriving in 3 successive waves, they would secure beachheads and push inland, their primary objective being to sever London from the rest of the country. Once the capital was isolated, the occupation would begin in earnest. The Gestapo had compiled lists of roughly 2,000 individuals to be arrested at the earliest opportunity, a group that ranged from Winston Churchill to the writers Aldous Huxley and Virginia Woolf, to the playwright and actor Noel Coward, whose particular brand of wit had apparently earned him a place on German security planners' lists of people requiring immediate attention. All able-bodied men between the ages of 17 and 45 were to be interned and in due course transferred to the continent. The security of the crossing itself would depend on vast minefields laid along the western and eastern flanks of the invasion corridor, blocking the Royal Navy's most direct lines of approach and giving the transport fleet enough time to make the passage and deliver its soldiers. Above all of it, and preceding everything, the Luftwaffe would have to hold the skies. Before the first barge could leave the French coast, the RAF would need to be destroyed or rendered incapable of effective resistance. This was not a precondition anyone in the German command was treating as a technicality. It was the central and determining requirement of the entire operation, and everyone involved understood it in those terms. The plan had coherence in the abstract. 250,000 soldiers landing simultaneously across a broad front, supported from the air and supplied by sea. If the preconditions were met, the logic was credible. An island, however determined its defenders, had to spread its resistance across a very long perimeter. A sufficiently broad and simultaneous assault could find gaps in that perimeter that a narrower one could not. What the plan required was the fulfillment of conditions that no one could yet guarantee. Among the planners of Operation Sea Lion, one voice had been sounding a different note from the beginning. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, did not oppose the invasion of Britain in principle. His objection was far more specific than that. He was opposed to the way his colleagues in the Army and the Air Force appeared to be thinking about it, as though it were an operation of a familiar kind, requiring only modest adaptations of the methods that had proved so effective on the rivers and plains of the campaigns already completed. What troubled Raeder, apart from the serious losses his navy had suffered during the Norwegian campaign and had not yet fully made good, was a fundamental error embedded in how the planning discussions were being conducted. His colleagues seemed to regard the English Channel as a wider than usual river. They acknowledged, naturally, that it was wider. They accepted that this would require modifications to standard procedure, but their underlying picture of the crossing, an attacking force moving from one bank to the other under covering fire, with engineers managing the transport function, had simply been scaled up to accommodate the greater distance without the full implications of that distance being genuinely absorbed. Raeder understood those implications from first principles. The Channel was not a river, it was a tidal sea with its own patterns of weather and current and an uneven temperament, and the difference between a smooth crossing and a disastrous one could arrive with very little warning. The soldiers who had crossed the Rhine and the Meuse had faced guns and defenders. The soldiers who crossed the Channel would face those things, and also the water itself, 25 miles of open sea that could, at short notice, become entirely hostile to flat-bottomed river barges designed for the sheltered commerce of inland routes. He made these points, and he made them repeatedly, in formal memoranda and in the less formal language of staff meetings. When he argued that the invasion front as originally conceived was too broad, that his navy lacked the capacity to simultaneously protect and supply a crossing over 200 miles of coastline, the Army's response was that a narrower front would funnel the attacking troops into what the Army commander described bluntly as a sausage machine. The front had to be wide enough to prevent the defenses from concentrating against it. Raeder acknowledged the tactical logic. He simply maintained that what the Army wanted was beyond his Navy's current means to support. Hitler settled, at least tentatively, on a compromise, a reduced front that excluded the area west of the Isle of Wight, trimming the most ambitious edges of the original plan without altering its fundamental character. The Army's senior leadership, General von Brochich and General Halder, reaffirmed their commitment to the operation with confidence. Sea Lion could succeed, they told Hitler. They had given him their professional judgment. They had also, with considerable care, attached a condition to that judgment. Before the seaborne crossing could be launched, the Luftwaffe would first have to neutralize the RAF and clear the skies above the Channel. The Army would not commit its soldiers to the crossing until that precondition had been met. This was strategically defensible. It was also enormously convenient for everyone except the Luftwaffe. By making the RAF's defeat the mandatory prerequisite, the Army's commanders had effectively transferred the central risk of the entire operation onto Goering's shoulders. If the Luftwaffe succeeded, the seaborne landing would proceed and the Army would take the field with the skies already secured above them. If the Luftwaffe failed, there would be no crossing, no engagement with the Royal Navy in the Channel, no catastrophic losses of the kind that Raeder had been warning against. Raeder was, by his own account in later years, profoundly relieved by this arrangement. It shielded him from the scenario he had consistently argued was dangerous, committing the remainder of his naval forces against the Royal Navy in circumstances that would favor the defenders at virtually every point. If the Luftwaffe could not break the RAF, The Navy would not be required to test itself against the fleet waiting on the far side of the Channel. The problem would simply not arise. And if the RAF were destroyed and the invasion proceeded, then Hitler himself would be in supreme command of what followed, and whatever came of it, triumph or catastrophe, would be his to answer for. It was a structure that served almost everyone at the table, everyone that is, except the pilots who would be required to resolve the summer's central question over the skies of a country fighting for its survival. Even then, Hitler was not quite ready to release the last remaining possibility of a settlement. He was a man who, under pressure from unwanted decisions, had a persistent inclination to search for one more opening, one more chance to avoid committing to what he had already, in practical terms, set in motion. The invasion he had authorized was real. The preparations were underway, but the Luftwaffe would go first, and Sea Lion would follow, and in the interval between those two things there was still, in theory, time for Britain to reconsider. On the 19th of July, he summoned the Reichstag to the Kroll Opera House in Berlin. The boxes were crowded with foreign diplomats who had made the journey specifically because they had heard the circulating rumors that something significant was about to be offered, that a final peace proposal was coming. They arranged themselves in their seats with the alertness of observers who believe they are about to witness something consequential. The speech was long. It opened, as these occasions customarily did, with an extended survey of Germany's recent achievements, the campaigns, the victories, the remarkable scale and speed of what had been accomplished in 9 months of war. Hitler moved through the record with the satisfaction of someone reading aloud from his own story, and the assembly responded with the enthusiasm that had become, in such settings, entirely predictable. The passage that the foreign diplomats had come to hear arrived toward the end. Framing it as a solemn obligation rather than a preference, Hitler declared that the moment had come, in good faith, to appeal to reason and sound judgment on the part of Great Britain. He spoke as a victor, he said, appealing from that position, not as a defeated man asking for relief. He saw no reason, he told the assembly, why this war should continue. The obstacle to peace, he charged, was a single individual, Winston Churchill, whose fanaticism and personal vanity were driving a nation toward catastrophe. The British people were being kept from the truth by Churchill and those around him. They were being sacrificed, in essence, to the ambitions of a man too proud or too deluded to see what any clear-eyed person could plainly observe. His voice rose toward the end. He spoke of a great empire, one he had never wished to harm, whose civilization he held in genuine respect, being carried toward ruin by one man's recklessness. It almost caused him pain, he said, that fate had selected him for this role. If the peace he was offering was refused, the consequences would fall on those who had refused it, and he could not bear responsibility for what followed. That evening, German aircraft crossed the Channel carrying a specific cargo, printed leaflets containing the full text of the Reichstag address, dropped across southern England so that the British population might read what their government, in the German framing, had been keeping from them. In fact, the speech had been broadcast in its entirety over British radio and was reproduced in full in the morning newspapers. There was nothing hidden about it. The reply came from the BBC within an hour of Hitler leaving the podium. A British journalist named Sefton Delmer gave it, without waiting for official permission and without any diplomatic softening. He addressed the Führer directly in German, making the mode of address as pointed as its content. He said that the British people had heard this appeal to what Hitler was pleased to call their reason and common sense. He told him, with a brevity that required no elaboration, that they were hurling it directly back into what he described as Hitler's evil-smelling teeth. It was a journalist speaking for himself without instruction, and in that very quality lay much of its significance. The diplomats in the Kroll Opera House boxes had travelled to Berlin hoping to witness the beginning of a negotiation. They went home without it. By then, most of the German general staff had also ceased to expect a British capitulation, alongside the disappointment felt by those who had taken Hitler's assessment at face value. There was a different and more operational feeling, something like relief. The uncertainty was over. The brakes had been lifted. The war could be brought fully back to life, and its next great chapter could begin. The evening of the 19th of July found Hermann Goering at home in Berlin, and he had considerable reason to mark the occasion. In the course of the Reichstag address, Hitler had announced the elevation of 12 of Germany's most senior generals to the rank of Field Marshal, a recognition of their roles in the conquests of Poland and France that bestowed upon them the highest rank in the German military hierarchy. 3 of those elevated were Luftwaffe generals, Erhard Milch, Albert Kesselring, and Hugo Sperler, the same men who had sat around the conference table on the armoured train 6 weeks earlier, while Milch had delivered his unsettling correction of Goering's Dunkirk assessment. For Goering himself, something beyond Field Marshal had been created. There had never in the history of the German armed forces been any rank above it, and so the Führer had required an entirely new designation. The citation was read aloud in the Opera House. For his contribution to victory, Hermann Goering was to be elevated to Reich Marshal of the Greater German Reich and awarded the Grand Cross of the Iron Cross. No soldier in German military history had ever held such a rank. It stood alone at the summit of the hierarchy, answerable only to the Führer, and it belonged to him alone. The dinner party he gave that evening at his Berlin residence, the Leipziger Palace, reflected the magnitude of the occasion in very specific material terms. The food and wine on the table had been gathered from the countries Germany had recently defeated, and the table showed it with some completeness. Among the guests was a young Swede named Thomas von Kanzow, the son of Goering's first wife Karin, who had died years earlier and in whose memory the East Prussian estate was named. Thomas remembered the evening with considerable clarity long afterward. Goering had brought pâté de foie gras back from Paris. The toasts were made in coloured vodkas from Poland, a different colour for each toast, working through the sequence of the evening. Salmon from Danzig was accompanied by wine drawn from a cellar Goering had acquired in Trier. Goose from his own estate was served alongside a Bordeaux of distinction. Viennese pastries concluded the main progression. Afterward, the men moved to Napoleon brandy while the women drank French liqueurs. The wives wore the latest Parisian fashions and had applied the perfumes that Paris had been producing before swastika flags appeared on its public buildings. Everyone, Thomas recalled, became rather tipsy. It was, in his words, a very jolly and sentimental occasion. It was also, in a way that the warmth of the evening made difficult to perceive, a moment poised at a particular edge. The man being celebrated was about to carry the most consequential assignment of the war, the destruction of Britain's air force, the single precondition without which no crossing was possible, the hinge on which the entire strategic future of the conflict would turn, was about to be placed in his hands. The weight of that responsibility had not yet fully announced itself. There was still celebrating to be done, still toasts to drink, still the pleasure of rank and recognition to absorb. The days that followed wore a different quality. By the 6th of August, Goering had travelled from Berlin to Karinhal, the elaborate country estate in East Prussia that bore his first wife's name and served as something between a private refuge and a working headquarters. He summoned the Luftwaffe's senior commanders there, the newly elevated Field Marshals Milch, Kesselring and Sperler among them, and addressed them with the full authority of his new rank. The attacks on Britain's air defences were to be intensified without limit, he told them. The full strength of the Luftwaffe was to be brought to bear against the RAF and everything supporting it. The airfields, the radar stations, the supply lines, the ground infrastructure that bound the whole system together. The operation's opening phase had been given a name, Eagle Day. The date was set for the 10th of August. He had informed the Führer, he said, that the RAF would be eliminated in time for Operation Sea Lion to be launched on the 15th of September. German soldiers would land on British soil on that date, he added, with the casual ease of a man who has already decided the outcome, that he considered the time he was allowing the Luftwaffe more than sufficient, generous in fact, and that he expected Britain to be rendered effectively defenceless well before the deadline arrived. His tone when speaking of the RAF's pilots and aircraft was openly dismissive. The Luftwaffe was superior in every measure, he said, in the quality of its men, the capability of its machines, and in sheer numbers. Germany's air fleets outnumbered the British by at least 2 to 1, with substantial reserves waiting behind them. In these calculations, the newly created Reich Marshal would prove to be gravely and very expensively mistaken. Goering spoke to his assembled commanders on the 6th of August as though the Battle of Britain was still a future event, something that would begin on a chosen date, under ordered conditions, in a planned sequence. In the operational sense he was describing, this was accurate enough. Eagle Day had been set. The concentrated, systematic campaign against the RAF's airfields and supporting infrastructure had yet to officially begin. From the perspective of the men actually flying over the channel that same afternoon, however, the battle had already started. Even as the Luftwaffe's senior officers concluded their discussions at Karin Hall, a different kind of exchange was taking place several thousand feet above the grey water of the Strait of Dover. A formation of German dive bombers, flying with a fighter escort, had located a British convoy moving through the Narrows toward the Thames estuary and the port of London. Its mission was ordinary and necessary. The island required what it was carrying, but the route was contested, and the Luftwaffe had been practicing exactly this kind of attack for weeks. RAF fighters were scrambled to intercept. What followed stretched across the afternoon in a rolling series of engagements rather than a single decisive clash, breaking apart and reforming over the grey water, each encounter brief and violent and inconclusive on its own, until the last aircraft had broken off and turned back toward its airfield. The British had lost 6 planes, the Luftwaffe had lost 7. The convoy reached its destination. It was a small exchange by the measure of what was coming. 13 aircraft, a contested stretch of water, a merchant convoy that continued its journey. In the weeks ahead there would be days when those numbers seemed modest, but in that afternoon's fighting over the strait, something was already legible to anyone paying careful attention. The RAF was present, it was responding, it was holding its own against a force that had been described, within its own command, as overwhelmingly superior. The convoy got through. That same afternoon, in a Royal Air Force control room somewhere in the south of England, a smaller and stranger episode was unfolding, less dramatic in scale, and perhaps more revealing in its way. Members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force were at work at the plotting tables, tracking aircraft positions across the operations maps with the total concentration the work required. The loudspeakers fixed above them were connected directly to the radio channels of the RAF pilots currently engaged over the channel. The pilots spoke without ceremony in the heat of combat, their language shaped by the specific pressure of what they were doing, language that did not, under the circumstances, tend toward careful phrasing. The officer in charge of the room, observing this, formed the view that what was coming through the speakers was unsuitable for the women working below. He gave the order that they be moved out of range. The squadron officer who spoke on behalf of her staff refused. She did so calmly, without visible agitation, with the manner of someone raising an objection that seemed to her simply obvious. Most of us, she pointed out, had been hearing language of exactly this kind since childhood, from fathers and brothers who used it around the house without particular thought. And then she added, without raising her voice, she expected they were going to hear considerably worse than this before it was all over. She was right. There is something in that small exchange that captures with more precision than many larger events something essential about the country in that summer, a place that had looked clearly at what was coming, measured it without comforting illusion, and decided to remain exactly where it stood. The decision had not been made without fear. Fear was present and entirely reasonable. It had been made with full knowledge of the fear, and with a specific kind of resolution that had settled across the country in the week since the evacuation, not despite what people understood, but because of it. The Luftwaffe's senior officers believed, from their reconnaissance files and their intelligence assessments and their calculations of comparative strength, that they knew what they were facing. They had built a detailed picture, and it was accurate in every detail that it contained. What it could not contain, what no camera flying at altitude over the Kentish countryside had ever been able to capture, was the particular quality that had formed itself on the far side of the channel across that long and watchful summer. The hardest weeks were still ahead. The skies above England would carry scenes of violence and courage and loss that those involved would never fully leave behind. What was already true as August arrived and the serious business was about to begin was that Britain had made its decision, and nothing that followed was going to change it.